Okay, we are welcoming you all to session number 2, which is called, Is There a God? Believe it or not, we're going to answer this question.
No.
That's chutzpah. Okay. So everybody can see the PowerPoint, I think.
Yes.
So what I want to point out is I do record these sessions. So if you go to my website, that's the main screen. You click over where it says classes and then scroll down, but not very far, is this little description of this 3-class series. And if you click right there, you will see the video of the first class, and sometime either tonight or tomorrow or something, I will post the video of this class. And then, as I mentioned last time, also clicking classes and then clicking handouts of lectures and classes. I have a 3-session version of this class. I have a PowerPoint in Spanish that I developed for a group in Guatemala, and a 1-session version of bibliography and just 1 page of significant quotes. Okay, so I'm going to pick up at what I think was the critical point last time. And as I mentioned last time, feel free to interrupt, ask questions, and so on. Right now I can see those of you who have who have your cameras on, but actually I don't, and I don't know why. I think this is one of these things that while I'm in the display, the PowerPoint mode, I can't see the list of participants. So you can either raise your hand using the participants tab, or just start talking. The group isn't so big that we can't accommodate that. Okay, so as I stressed several times, and I do this all the time, I believe that there are 2 key leaps of faith associated with religion. Leap of faith number 1 is there a God? And by God, I mean an intelligence behind the creation of the universe. And in some ways, in Jewish tradition, as you probably know, 2 very common names of God, or words used to represent God in Scripture, are Elohim and Adonai. And in rabbinic thinking, the word Elohim can refer to judges. It can be gods plural, or it's God as a generic term for a job description, namely God. And Adonai is more of a personal, caring God of compassion. And, we can get into the text behind that. But, so, leap of faith number 1, which really is the focus for tonight, and depending on how quickly or slowly we go, it may be the only thing we discuss tonight, is there a intelligence behind the creation of the universe, or is the universe just sort of a physical, chemical, biological accident? On that one, as we're going to see, there's a lot of evidence, and you can decide for yourself whether that evidence constitutes proof. That's leap of faith number 1. Leap of faith number 2 is, does God care? And we might call a caring God Adonai. Actually, I don't so much use that for the rest of the talk, but I think that actually works with Jewish tradition, those 2 names. So leap of faith number 2 is, does God care whether I have turkey or ham for dinner, to put it on a sort of a trivial level, or whether I care for or torture babies? So the question is, does this organizing source of the universe get involved in, or even think about or care about, our personal lives? That, as you'll see, I think is largely a matter of faith. And I will show you the 1 piece of evidence from physics and nature that I have, and I've convinced almost no one that that's a good piece of evidence.
Yeah.
But surprisingly enough, it hasn't stopped me from using it. Okay, so the question is, can we prove that God exists? So some would say yes. Here is a wonderful book by a Catholic priest who is, he's got an amazing mind in both physics and philosophy, Father Robert Spitzer. and his book is called New Proofs for the Existence of God. Terrific book. Has about half of it is physics, half of it is philosophy. I understood the physics part. I did not understand the philosophy part. But he would say yes. But before we get into whether God exists, the question is, what do we mean by God? So on one level, I would say in Jewish tradition, we're talking about the God of Abraham as distinguished from older gods, Babylonian gods, Egyptian gods, Roman gods, Canaanite gods. Danny Matt, who is the preeminent scholar on the Zohar and Kabbalah, has a definition that God is the name we give to the oneness of all. Fixing God into a particular image is literally idolatry. So I often talk to people who very vociferously proclaim, I don't believe in God. And then one of my comments is always, well, tell me about this God that you don't believe in. And they will have some sort of very anthropomorphic description, an old man, with a beard sitting on a throne somewhere, fiddling around with our lives. And of course, my response is, I don't believe in that God either. So for purposes of leap number one, I will use this concept of organizing intelligence in the universe and leave for leap number two, a God who hears or answers prayers or gets involved with the world, okay? So can we prove that God exists? As I said, some would say yes, but I would say if we could prove that God's existence, someone would have done it by now. And by proof, it's a set of arguments, statements, which convince most people. And I often use the foil of, some people will argue that the earth is flat, but we have actually proven in several different ways that the earth is not flat. Yes, I know there's a flat earth society, but even they don't take themselves seriously. Ira, you have your hand raised.
You say no one has proven God's existence. I beg to differ. Moses.
Well, I mean, I would challenge you to prove Moses' existence.
Okay.
But what I mean by that,
I have trouble proving I exist sometimes.
Well, then you have to read the other half of that book, which I couldn't understand. What I mean by that literally is there are very intelligent people whose opinion and judgment I respect. Some of them are even attending this class that do not believe in God. And so therefore, I would say that proof doesn't exist, certainly not to their satisfaction. And while I might spend some time and will spend some time offering evidence, I would not go so, and for me, the evidence is compelling. I would not go so far as to say that evidence constitutes proof. So I mentioned last time this wonderful quote from Einstein that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And now I'm going to take you on about a 3-minute journey. And this 3-minute journey will take us from, 10 to the 26th meters away from Earth. So a 1 followed by 26 zeros. First thing we're going to see is we're going to back out away from this lovely young woman's face. We're going to back out to the edge of the universe. And then we're going to go into her eye and get smaller and smaller down to a femtometer, which is 10 to the minus 15th meters. Okay, so in 3 minutes, we're going to go through 41 orders of magnitude. And it's fantastic. So sit back and enjoy. First of all, can everybody see it and hear it? Yes, okay.
Yes, sir.
Sherwin, hang on a second.
So if you're interested in getting on, I put the YouTube thing on there, but if you just Google cosmic eye, you'll actually see a couple of different versions of this. And no models were injured during the filming of this video, I just want to point out. So again, what boggles my mind, let me see if I back up, yeah, previous, is this idea, I'm going to pause it, is this idea that in our learning, in our current state of knowledge, we have some understanding, not complete understanding, but some understanding of the structure of the universe, the macro universe and the micro universe, from the atomic level and actually subatomic level to the end of the cosmos. So, I mean, to me, this is just absolutely mind-boggling. Okay, so now we're going to get into the question of evidence for God's existence. And here's the, Bryce?
One thing is, as you alluded to, we only understand what it is that we understand. So
yes,
we're impressed with what we are understanding, but there's plenty of stuff in the universe that we don't even have an inkling of, I assume, considering we keep discovering new things.
I would agree with that.
You know, there's a limit to what we might ever be able to comprehend. That is still is the universe.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether there is a limit or whether it's an asymptotic approach, namely we learn more and more, but don't learn everything. But it's mind-boggling to me that the lump of protoplasm between our ears can contemplate things that are billions of light years away, and femtometers, picometers, nanometers in size. I find that breathtaking.
We certainly are over-engineered.
I wouldn't say over, because we're still looking. Okay, so here is a good deal of the basic argument. What we're going to see is there are laws of physics, and they have complicated formulas, and I'm not going to get into any of the formulas, but in every formula, there is typically a constant. So I'll just talk about one. Here is a bottle cap. If I let go of this bottle cap, what will happen?
It'll fall.
Fall down.
It will fall. And it will fall because there's a force of attraction pulling it down. And Newton had a formula and calculated what the force of attraction is, and it's equal to the mass of the bottle cap times the mass of the Earth divided by the distance between their centers times some number. The structure of the formula is quite simple and beautiful, but we experimentally measure what the number is. And there's no inherent reason that the number has to be what it is that we found out. You can't, to my knowledge, derive the number from basic principles. It's just what you measure it to be. And so that's the gravitational constant. And there is also something called the electromagnetic force, as I think you know, that like charges repel each other and unlike charges attract each other. We have static electricity, we have magnetic forces, a formula that's virtually identical to the one I just showed you with a different number as a constant. And so inside of a sort of a, let's think about a primitive model for an atom. What's at the center of the atom? This is high school biology. Nucleus, very good. And what's outside of the center of the atom?
Electrons.
Terrific. And what charge are the electrons?
Negative.
Negative.
Negative. And what's inside the nucleus? Simple model.
Protons and neutrons.
Okay, what's the charge of the protons?
Positive.
Positive.
What's the charge of the neutrons?
Neutral.
Neutral.
Neutral, good. So the atom is stable.
Gluons.
I'm sorry?
Quarks and gluons.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into quarks and gluons. Okay. The atom is stable in this simple model because positive charge in the center, electrons whizzing around outside, right? And there's a force of attraction, and it's stable and everything's fine. Now think about, that's the electromagnetic force. Think about what's in the nucleus. You have protons, right?
Yes,
Do you have more than one?
usually.
Yeah.
Usually in everything but hydrogen, you're going to have more than one. They are the same charge. Does the same charge attract each other or repel each other?
Repel each other.
Oh.
Repel each other with tremendous force because they're so close to each other.
Right.
So therefore, there must be a strong nuclear force,
yes.
which is called, big surprise, the strong nuclear force,
Yes.
which holds the nucleus of the atom together. And there's a formula and there's a constant. So let's think about this. If, let's say I tweak with the gravitational constant a little bit and I make it less. The good news is we all lose weight, okay? The bad news is if I keep doing that, then the gravitational force is so diffuse that stars never form. Matter never gets attracted to one another, and stars never form, and the whole universe is just dust. Or just hydrogen atoms, probably. We're going to see that a little bit more. Let's think about the electromagnetic force. We have these electrons happily circling the nucleus, right? If I make that force a lot stronger than it is, they might tend to collide, but the electrons would find themselves associated only with one atom. You can think about this. I don't think I've ever used this term, and maybe no one else has ever used this term, atomic monogamy. The atoms, the electrons are only tied or connected with their host atom. But it turns out that the electromagnetic force is just loose enough so the atoms can share their electrons. Isn't that nice? They share. Robin, isn't that what you taught your students to do?
Absolutely.
Right. So I have 2 hydrogen atoms that hang out in the neighborhood of an oxygen atom. And instead of having gaseous hydrogen stingily hoarding its electrons and
Water.
gaseous oxygen stingily hoarding its electrons, I have, you know, mayim l'chaim. And I mean that literally. I have water, which is the key to life. If the electrostatic attraction is reduced even further, the electrons just go flying away. And I have a state of matter called a plasma. And suffice it to say, it's also not going to be very good to drink. I remember, I have this on the slide, the expansion velocity after the Big Bang. I'm not so sure this is true, but I read it somewhere. And so think about the Big Bang, way back when, and then things are starting to fly out. The velocity of the expansion of the Big Bang, if it were really, really slow, or if it was somewhat slower than what it turned out to be, the gravitational forces would cause the things flying out to fall back in and have a big crunch. Not an interesting universe. If it's a little bit less than what it turned out to be, everything flies out and we just have dust. And in this one text I came across, we hit the right velocity to a factor of 1 divided by 1 followed by 27 zeros. So we hit it exactly right. But it turns out that the ratios of some of these numbers are also key. So there's a very interesting book by Martin Rees called Just 6 Numbers, The Deep Forces That Shape the Universe. So here are some of the examples that he has. Remember I talked about the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force. It's probably upside down here because I'm sorry. The electromagnetic force is much greater than gravitational force.
Correct.
It's a 1 followed by 36 zeros. If I divide it, I get 1 followed by 36 zeros. If I have a few less zeros, I have a short-lived mini universe with no time for evolution. Another ratio, easy to remember, 0.007, which is the fraction of energy released when hydrogen fuses to form helium. This is connected with the strong nuclear force and how firmly the atomic nuclei are bound. The number is actually 0.007.
What if it refuses?
I'm sorry?
What if it refuses?
The hydrogen atoms fuse and they form a heavier atom. Oh, I see. Refuses. Yes. I'm sorry. When I'm in my nerd mode, Robin, don't try and talk to me. But thank you. That was good. If instead of 0.007, it's 006, then there's no fusion. The atoms never get together to form heavier atoms, and the entire universe is hydrogen. Not an interesting universe. I'm
no
sorry?
Bond.
No,
No
oh, very,
bond.
very good, very good, very good.
I had to pull a Bob Grossman.
Oh, that's very good. Make yourself a martini shaken. If the number were 008, then all the hydrogen atoms would fuse to form helium atoms and other heavier atoms, and there would be no hydrogen. And hydrogen is the basis of life as we know it. Now, there may be other life forms. If you read enough science fiction, you'll see speculation about other atoms that are similar. But you certainly would have no hydrocarbon and no water. But wait, there's more. So the basic idea here is there are about 20 of these constants, and they all seem to be selected within a very narrow range of values to create an anthropic universe. By anthropic universe, we mean a universe that can support life and specifically anthros, humanity. Murray, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I take issue with the word you just said, selected, because
Yes, no, okay, yes.
That's implying an intelligent force.
Yes.
What I want to say is, there's something called infinite monkeys theorem, and basically, a room full of monkeys will type out Hamlet.
Yes,
It'll
yes,
take a long time,
and we can calculate the probabilities.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying.
And that's exactly what I'm going to do right now.
Well, in the beginning of both sessions, this week and last Wednesday, you start off with what my belief is that this is just a happy accident.
Oh, I never believe that.
Well, no, you said there's either created by God or is it just dumb luck? And I believe in the dumb luck universe.
Okay, but the nice thing about this is we can actually calculate the probability that the numbers turned out just right. And so in Spitzer's book, he quotes another physicist who has worked out that probability.
But the probability doesn't matter if there are lots and lots of universes, multiverses and all that. Because then,
Yes. Yes. So let me, before I leave this slide, I will address that. Okay. So the odds of the anthropic universe arising amidst all possible universes is 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 132nd power. Unless you're really familiar with scientific notation, you won't appreciate how small this number is, except to say if I were to write down the number in the denominator, 10 to the 10th to the 132nd power, in 10-point type, that writing would consume most of the volume of the universe. It's an incomprehensibly small number, which is to say that the probability of hitting all these numbers right is vanishingly small. For example, the number of atoms in the universe is only 10 to the 78th power. So this is actually.
But in a large enough multiverse, it only takes
so let me address that. A reasonable criticism, why this isn't a proof, is that there are 10 to the 10th to the 132nd power universes, that there are a bazillion universes out there.
More than that.
You're more than that. Yeah,
I think
much
you've
more
gotta
than
go,
that.
Rabbi.
Well,
think
I don't know how much a bazillion actually is.
I think you're going to have to go with gazillion here.
Yes, gazillion. Okay, so here's why that argument is not compelling to me. The argument about the hypothesis of a multiverse, multiple universes, every time it's been explained to me, always has the provisos that these universes can't influence or detect one another. So what we're saying is, I have a physics theory which can solve Lotker's supposition that there must be an intelligent designer, but there's no way you can test my theory. And I think that violates what it means to have a scientific theory. It's as though I would say, this bottle cap falls not because of gravity, but because there are invisible sterling silver springs pulling it.
Sterling
And-
silver.
Oh, I see. It's
valuable.
impossible to prove. Kind of like religion, isn't it?
No, I'm not proving religion. I never said I can prove the existence of God, and I'm just presenting evidence, okay? But at least with in this discussion, I would argue that I'm presenting evidence of God's existence. I can't think of any evidence of a multiverse except to disprove God's existence.
Well, I mean, the multiverse theory solves the Copenhagen interpretation.
I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's the observation thing when it exists as a wave until you look at it, and then suddenly it becomes a particle. So being a wave, it's in different parallel universes.
It's the collapse of the wave function. That's what he's talking about, the collapse of the wave function.
Okay, I've
And,
never heard that you need a multiverse to explain that, but I could be wrong.
I have a book,
Okay,
Parallel Universes from Fred Alan Wolf. He was also a physicist and also a Kabbalist, and I would recommend it to anybody.
okay, great.
Show
Okay,
yourself, Murray.
I don't have a camera.
okay,
Sorry.
let's continue. Everybody has the right to remain invisible. There are other examples of evidence for God's existence that I would present to you. According to the laws of physics, if you have an orbit, such as a planet orbiting a star, that orbit is an ellipse. An ellipse is kind of like a circle, except it's oblong. If an ellipse has a perfect eccentricity, is the technical term, then it's a circle. But every planet has some eccentricity. So in the case of the Earth, I think we, at our closest to the sun, we're 91 million miles away from the sun. At our farthest from the sun, we're 95 million miles away. So there's some unevenness to our orbit. I would say eccentricity to our orbit. But it's far more circular than any other planet. The next most circular planet is Mars. If we had the eccentricity of Mars, we would have no life on Earth, because when we'd be far from the sun, all the water on Earth would freeze. And when we get close to the sun, all the water on Earth would evaporate. So we happen to be exactly in the right spot.
The Goldilocks zone.
Yes, and I'm going to talk about Goldilocks. Another one that's always struck me as fascinating is, if you have ice cubes, do they float or do they sink?
They float.
They float. And the reason for that is, when water freezes, for some strange reason, it expands. Almost everything else as it freezes contracts as it gets colder and as it freezes. For some reason, and I've talked with chemists about this, it has to do with the nature of the bond, the water expands. What that means is, in ice skating rinks in Minnesota and so on, as winter approaches and the temperature gets colder and colder, the water freezes on top, allowing liquid water to be preserved underneath. In many cases, certainly not all, there are places where it freezes solid. And that encourages the development of aquatic life, which can go on swimming and not be literally frozen. Another oddity, and this is the most technical slide I'm going to show, in most cases, if you think about water and you dive into a lake or a pool, as you go down to the bottom of the lake or the pool, does the water get colder or warmer?
Colder.
Older.
Colder, right.
Colder.
As you go down in temperature, this is temperature, the density of the water increases, so the cold water sinks down toward the bottom. Everybody with me?
Yes.
But it's another oddity of the water molecule is it reaches a maximum of at about 4 degrees centigrade, or about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So the most dense water, the water at the very bottom of the pond, preserves that 40 degrees until it freezes solid. It's another oddity of the water molecule, which helps evolution continue. There is this thing. I don't know if Bryce, you are familiar with there's a wonderful author, Robert Piccioni, lives in Westlake Village. He's written a whole bunch of interesting books, and he talks about the Goldilocks zone.
Sure, that's very common.
Okay, so among the elements that make our particular location in the universe extraordinarily habitable is our galaxy is a pretty good place in which to live. There are no massive black holes at the center emitting radiation that would sterilize us. And we reside actually in a relatively placid group of 30 galaxies that haven't collided with each other. We are actually in a favorable neighborhood inside our galaxy. We're far enough from the core to avoid radiation and high-speed colliding stars, but close enough to the center to have sufficient carbon, oxygen, and other elements for life. Our solar system began late enough, only about 4.5 billion years ago, to avoid major galactic collisions and quasars.
And it evolved.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If God made Earth so perfect, with low eccentricity in the orbit and all that, so we could survive, why did God also make Mars and Venus and all those others?
Well, why isn't any of this in the Bible?
Okay, it's not in the Bible because the biblical authors were unaware of it. I am now presenting evidence for God's existence. I can't imagine, from a physics point of view, a stable universe where there's only Earth. I mean, most stars have many planets. Most planets have many moons. So, I mean, on one answer, I could say God knows, but I'm not trying to present an airtight case. Remember, I'm not saying this is proof of God's existence. I am reacting with awe on how well things have worked out.
Michael,
Yes.
Rabbi, sorry
Yes.
about that.
Yeah.
Have we been able to examine other solar systems to see if they have any planets within them which are a similar distance from their sun in relation to the size of the sun?
Yes, the answer is yes and yes. And I would expect as time goes on to discover life on other planets.
Okay.
And that doesn't interfere
I understand.
with,
I understand, but
Okay.
it just raised the question.
A couple
Yeah.
of things I want to say. That one, that if our sun were more eccentric, if the situation were different,
right,
then the type of life we would have here would be different and evolved to survive those situations.
So are you suggesting there's life on all of the other planets?
No, I'm suggesting that there's going to be some kind of a probability for
Yes, I agree with you.
development of life, and I think it's going to be very common. Most of it won't be intelligent, but there will be life. There's probably other life in the solar system. But
that'll be interesting to find out. But I don't disagree with you, Murray.
It sounds like you're making a case for a really God, into details making this habitable for humans, but this planet was actually, I mean, it's really good for bacteria.
Yes.
The dinosaurs were doing really great until
Yes.
some freak accident happened.
Yes.
Otherwise, we never would have
Yes.
been here.
So let me just suggest that you don't try and refute my arguments or come up with alternative arguments until I'm finished presenting the argument. And remember, all I'm doing is I'm not presenting a proof. I am presenting what I consider to be evidence, understanding that many people will look at this evidence and conclude that it's not conclusive. Just a few other things. The sun, our sun, first is a single sun. Most stars are binary stars. If
Or
we,
trinary.
I'm sorry, or trinary, more than one. If we had a bunch of suns orbiting each other, it would make our orbit very eccentric and unstable and not conducive to orderly evolution. The sun's luminosity is extraordinarily stable among stars. Let's just see. We have Jupiter. We have a nice neighbor, Jupiter. It turns out Jupiter's gravity, about 300 times more than Earth's, protects us from asteroids and comets. We have a moon, in case you haven't noticed. The moon was probably the result of a collision, an asteroid that got through with the Earth, and it created an extraordinarily large satellite, the moon, orbiting the Earth.
Correct.
Most planets have satellites, and we're discovering many, many more than Galileo was aware of with an optical telescope, but none are anywhere near comparable to the mass of the moon. The other thing is this collision, physicists theorize, created a molten core and a gravitational field within our core, which is much higher than other planets' gravitational field. And as you'll see, that protects us from cosmic radiation. Sorry?
You mean magnetic field?
Magnetic field, yeah, sorry. My brain isn't quite engaged. It's about 100 times larger than any other planet. And we'll see how that actually protects.
Any other rocky planet, Jupiter's magnetic field is hellacious. And
Okay,
also Ganymede, in other words, I think what you meant to say was that the ratio between our mass and the moon's mass are very, very close in comparison with the other planets in the solar system, with the exception of, well, Pluto's a planetoid. But the point being is that our moon, for the size of the planet, is remarkable.
And one of the consequences of having such a massive moon is it makes the spin of our planet stable.
That's right.
So, and that makes the seasons stable and reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it seems to me, maybe not to you, to be precisely chosen to allow life on this planet.
The problem that we have, Rabbi, is that we've got a magnetic field that flips. And when the magnetic field flips, Katie, bar the door. It's going to be bad, and we're kind of due for a flip in the next few tens of centuries.
Okay, well, please text me if you know this is happening. I'll get it.
Or your DSP.
I will get under my chair. Yeah, this is more detail. I didn't recall that I had. So again, we're just enough to the sun, close enough to the sun to allow for liquid water. This is like 100,000th of the solar system. Okay. So here's a picture of me. What did you do on your vacation? About 4 or 5 years ago, I went to Churchill, Manitoba, where the actual temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and to see the northern lights. And one consequence of our magnetic field is that the magnetic field channels solar wind and solar particles to the north and south magnetic poles, rather than just impinging on the entire planet. And my understanding is that this magnetic field would eventually strip the atmosphere. I'm sorry, that the solar wind, if we were not protected by the magnetic field, would eventually strip our atmosphere away. And there's evidence that Mars may have had an atmosphere at one time, but the solar wind strips it away. Okay, we're going to move to DNA. We're going to move from sort of physics to biology. So once again, we have the same question. Life and DNA developed on Earth almost immediately after the Earth cooled. So the question then, same question. Was the creation of DNA an accident or guided somehow? One bit of evidence that it's not so easy to produce a strand of DNA is that even though the structure of DNA was discovered in 1953, and in laboratories we have all kinds of equipment to set up temperatures and pressures and the correct collection of chemicals to form DNA, we haven't been able to form a single strand of DNA in the laboratory. So the question is, can this be an accident? And again, Robert Piccioni, and he does a calculation, and I haven't checked his numbers. I have spoken to him about it, but here's his analysis. And he has a fun way of presenting it. So suppose I gave you the proverbial deck of cards, and I said, I want you to pull the ace of spades out the very first time. The odds of getting it correct is 1 in 52. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Suppose
they
I
usually put extra cards in there like the jokers. So
yeah, no, and it's not. I'm not doing a magic trick. I'm just illustrating probabilities. So suppose I say that's too easy. Do it twice in a row without making a mistake. Anybody know what the odds would be?
52 times 52.
Yes, the odds of doing it twice in a row would be 1 in 52 squared, or 2,704. Too easy. Do it 5 times in a row. That would be 1 in 52 to the 5th power, 52 times 52 times 52 times 52 times 52, or 1 in roughly 380 million, okay? The odds that DNA formed as quickly as it did in the universe, I used to think he was just talking about on Earth, but I have since spoken to him about it. In the universe, he calculates as pulling that ace of spades 119,000 times in a row without making a mistake.
I object to the assumptions.
You object to what assumptions?
The assumptions that have been made that DNA would be formed by a random accident. DNA would be formed by evolution that ends up being selected for by competition. It's not an impossible task as long as you understand that it evolves through time. If you have to make it wholly out of nothing, then yes, it's impossible.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I don't know. I have to talk to him again to ask him, to what extent that was considered. But again, a book, I think it's on my bookshelf, said, in the beginning, God created evolution. So I absolutely believe in evolution, and I believe evolution is God's tool. But I think it's a reasonable critique, and that's exactly what this.
You said it happened immediately.
I said
after, so there wouldn't have been time for evolution.
Well, immediately in terms of the life of the
Supporting
universe.
your argument.
In terms of the life of the universe. Yeah, and I don't know to what extent he took that into. It's a good question for me to ask him. So, in Genesis 1:26, the Torah says, God says, let us make humanity in our image. And the noteworthy thing about the Hebrew, correctly translated, is God is using the first person plural. And only in this creation story does God speak in the first person plural. Usually God says, I am the Lord thy God who took you, with deep voice appropriately. God often speaks in the first person singular. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, and so on. So, the suggestions is it's a royal we. For Christians, there's no issue here at all. God is a Trinity, so speaking for his triune self, and in this case, I can say at least one of the elements of the Trinity would be undeniably male for Christians. The traditional Jewish explanation is God was speaking to the heavenly host, namely angelic creatures up there somewhere with God. And a modern explanation that I really like is that God was talking to the animals. On the sixth day, all the animals had been created, and God said, let us make humanity in our image. So we are both created in an animal image, some of us more of an animal than others, but we have to do all the things the animals do. We have to eat, breathe, eliminate waste, and so on. And also Judaism would teach that we are also created in the divine image. And God speaking to all of creation and saying, let us make humanity, I think is a biblical proof text stretched a little bit for evolution. Murray.
Well,
Perhaps perhaps God was shaving his face and he was looking in the mirror, and then suddenly he thought, let us make man in our image. You know, just like he hadn't thought of it, just like, because us seems to imply maybe he's just talking to himself, and the image seems to...
Okay, so let me make a serious point. In Jewish tradition, every jot and tittle and detail of Torah text has significance. Therefore, we really need to focus on this. And just as you mentioned last week, in the very next verse, Murray, it says male and female, he created them. So there's evidence that God has male and female aspects.
Oh, I've looked at that sentence, and I don't think it's an accident. It happens at 126, since 26 is the gematria for Yud Hey Vav Hey.
Yes, now we're really getting into fun.
Okay,
Except the verse numbers were added much later, but I love it.
Rabbi,
Yes, Larry. And
can
then
I
Jim.
tell you why at least this one certainly fails to convince me that this is a proof of the existence of God? Because in order for that, I have to have another leap of faith, okay? Beyond God existing, beyond even God caring, I have to believe that he imparted the Torah.
Yes, and we're going to discuss that. But I'm actually not. What my point really is here, and I probably shouldn't even call it evidence for God's existence. What I should say is, I have none of my beliefs about God conflict with evolution.
I understand.
That's really the point, and I'm going to fix that. That's actually a very fix evolution slide. That's a very good point. Okay, Jim.
Let us make man in our image.
Right.
The animals didn't create man. So why wouldn't God have said, I will make man in our image, instead of, hey, let's all together make man in our image? I don't see animals creating us.
Okay, so this is the aspect of the verse that interests me, is I see it, my take on this, which is not traditional Judaism, it's my take on it, is God is going to involve the created world in the formation of humanity. So the apes, the chimpanzees, the slime mold are all busily doing their thing for millions and millions of years on the earth, and the result is humanity. So I mean, that is one message I get from the first person plural. Because if it said it could have easily said, let me make, or I will make humanity in my image. And then none of these questions would arise. Larry, or is it your?
No, I had asked it. So.
Okay. Okay, let me move on.
Could I add something?
Of
Possibly.
course.
You know, when we're saying let us create, I'm envisioning the manager or the owner of a factory complex. And he is getting up and he is talking to his working people.
Right.
Let us create.
So who is God talking to?
He is talking as management to the workers. In other words, the whole rest of creation that he created, let us create. They're the working people who are actually going to do it, and he's going to oversee the mess. Let us create.
That is exactly precisely my point. Some more notable quotes. I think these are almost the last ones. Nobel Prize winning physicist Arnaud Penzias. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Sir Fred Hoyle, life arising through random chemical reactions was as likely as the assemblage of a 747 by a tornado whirling through a junkyard. Stephen Hawking, who is certainly not a deist, he's a noted atheist, says that if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even one part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before life would have formed. On the other hand, if had it been greater in one part in the million, the universe would have expanded too rapidly for stars and planets to form. And then Rambam at the bottom, I'm not going to read all of these, the only path to knowing God is through the study of science. And for that reason, the Bible opens with a description of creation. Okay, some final thoughts, and then we'll see. I might be able to start and talk about it a little more. I believe the evidence is overwhelming. I'm not calling it proof. Remember, I'm not proving God's existence. The key question is, how does this belief in God affect our lives? How many of you believe in the North Pole? Believe that there is an axis about which the Earth turns and there is a point up north somewhere around which it turns? Okay, pretty much everybody. How does that belief affect your life?
Well, it means I get to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, we can pursue it, but if you didn't believe in the North Pole, would you not be alive?
I don't know. Maybe I'm the one that's making the North Pole be there.
Okay. So my point is, we have beliefs, but the interesting question is, how do beliefs affect our lives? And specifically in terms of religion and Judaism, the question, I mean, there are often surveys asking people, do you believe in God? And the response is usually, I don't have the numbers in front of me, I have it in other places, is there are many people who say they believe in God. The question that interests me is, how does your belief in God influence your life? And then, you know, we talked, I think we talked last time a little bit about the issue of free will and uncertainty and doubt. And so, you know, we talked, I think last time, about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which states you can't know both the position and the momentum of a particle with a precision greater than a certain very small number. And also, and Murray, you raised this question, wave-particle duality. The way I understand it, but I haven't done physics in quite a while, the way I understand it is for certain kinds of experiments, for example, refracting light through a prism, the only way to understand that experiment is to understand the nature of light being a wave. For other kinds of phenomenon, such as the photoelectric effect,
Which
and
is
how
what
that
Einstein won the Nobel Prize for.
Yes, Einstein won a Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect. The only way to understand that is to assume that light is a particle. So the question is, which is it really? And the answer, I'm sorry?
It is both and neither.
Yes, but I'm not sure how my brain wraps around that. So what the point I'm making here is that's the way I read the Bible. And those of you who study Torah with me know that I love to study Torah as through sort of the eyes of scholarship. I want to know what Richard Elliott Friedman says about a bit of text being, in the J tradition or P tradition or E tradition. I want to know what words meant back then. I really want to dig into the text and understand it from a scholarly point of view, not from the point of view that this is what God revealed to Moses on Sinai. Then I go to the other model, and the other model is a pious tradition which says the text is the literal word of God. And therefore, I have to take every element of the text, even misspellings, oddities of grammar, and so on. I have to take them seriously. And what I'm really interested in doing is looking at what our rabbis of tradition did with these issues. And then how does that affect my life? I'll give you one example. I can't remember if I discussed this in the next section. When Cain famously murders Abel, and God asks him, "Where is your brother?" He famously responds, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And God is not happy with this response. And God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth." Except in the text, and I've never seen it translated this way. In the text, it's actually plural. Your brother's bloods cry out to me from the ground. So what the Talmud does with this is to say, what's the plural bloods? It's all of the Abel's line of his descendants that will never be born. And Cain has not only murdered Abel, but he's murdered a quarter of humanity and all the people who have never been born. And so the Talmud draws the lesson that to save a life is to save a world, and to murder a life is to murder a world. And those of you may recall at the very end of Schindler's List, you see all of Schindler's Jews, not all, but many.
Spoiler alert.
Yes, spoiler alert. And the descendants of his Jews marching past his grave and putting a stone on his grave. And this lesson, I think it's in Sanhedrin, is mentioned. And by the way, it's also in the Quran. They got it out of the Talmud. So if I only study the text as a scholar, I might conclude it's a typo. It's only one yud. It might have been a drop of some scholar's ink. And that's not very interesting to me. I'm thrilled to see how the rabbis of blessed memory took this one letter and created what I think is a very powerful ethical lesson out of it. Bryce.
I was going to say that if God, assuming the existence of a God, if God had given us a brain sufficient to actually comprehend the universe that we were put in, then you wouldn't have such a difficulty with wave-particle duality. You'd be able to appreciate it all at once, all right? And you wouldn't have to switch viewpoints. It's only that God deprived us of having a really useful brain.
I would say we have a very useful brain.
Well,
I was a physics PhD dropout. I am ashamed to say, I probably ought to write a song. Physicist dropout, couldn't understand.
God deprived us of
theory.
this.
Yes.
God deprived us of this for a very important reason. Because he knows that the joy is not in the knowing, the joy is in the discovering.
I like that, and I agree with it. I wouldn't necessarily ascribe divine will to it.
May I also just add one point that maybe we're just not there yet,
Yeah.
What did you say, Jerry?
Maybe we're just not there yet. It may take a century or 100 centuries or who knows what before we can fully comprehend the duality of a particle. Maybe we're just too primitive and we don't get it yet.
Yeah, and Einstein, died trying, and many other physicists are still trying for a unified field theory, which will connect all of these things. Okay, so what I would like to do is just start, because there's actually a lot of material to cover next week. So I'm going to start with your permission. So here we go. The question then is, remember, last time I discussed, or what I've been doing tonight, is discussing what I consider to be a leap of faith. Does God exist? Understanding what I mean by God is an organizing intelligence in the universe, and I've presented evidence and not proof. The next leap of faith is, does God care? Logically, it makes sense to me that if God cares about us, God would communicate God's caring. So I don't understand a world in which God passionately cares about you and I and so on, but has no connection with us. So that's the issue, or the consequence of God caring. Religion treats as revelation. So Jews have Hebrew Bible and Talmud and so on. Christians have a New Testament. Muslims have Quran. Other religious traditions have other sacred scriptures, which I would say, broadly speaking, have something to do with God connecting with humanity, and not all of them. I mean, I think, in Buddhism, it may not literally be that way. So then the question arises, which some of you started mentioning. A very important question is, how do I understand Revelation? And must I take Revelation literally? Can I take it seriously, but not literally? And for Jews, the big central issue in the Jewish world is what happened at Mount Sinai. The different movements and different streams in Judaism will all, I think, flow from the question of what happened at Mount Sinai. And what do I mean, does God care? And I sort of, eliminated this. I sort of discussed this, sorry. Does God care whether I'm kind or mean? Does God care whether I protect children or torture them? Does God care whether I observe the Sabbath or not? Does God care whether I have chicken or pork for dinner? That's what I mean. I'm not necessarily going to answer all those questions, but at least that's what I mean by God caring. So again, the question is, what happened at Sinai? And everybody knows Charlton Heston went up there and I would say in most imagination, the idea is Moses gets the 10 Commandments. But of course, in Jewish tradition, I just want to take a quick look at what's going on in the chat world. Okay. In Jewish tradition, Moses not only gets the 10 Commandments, but gets the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then also in Jewish tradition, it's understood that Moses got an oral revelation, which eventually becomes the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. So that's the central. If you're Orthodox, the belief is very firmly that the Torah is literally the word of God from Sinai. Some more stuff going on. My understanding of this is that something happened, but we have a human record, and that human record is imperfect. So here's a question for you. What is this I'm putting on the screen?
It's a cube.
Okay. It's a 2-dimensional representation of a cube.
Okay.
Three
Any other?
quadrilaterals.
I'm sorry?
3 quadrilaterals of different color shades.
Okay. It's what?
Quadrilateral.
Yes, they are quadrilaterals. I mean, you could argue there's 3, there's a 4th one. Actually, it's just some projected light and shadow on your screen. Little LED lights are lighting up and not lighting up. You think you guys can be snide, I can be Snyder. And the reason I have the carbon
Yes,
dot thing,
Mr. Snyder.
Yes,
Right.
I'll be Snyder. Okay, there's nothing more than photons impacting my retina.
Very, very good. So, but most people see a cube, yes? Psychologists tell us that 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and expectations. And I see a psychologist nodding, so I feel much better. Thank you, Cheryl.
Welcome.
I would say this affects what gets written down at Sinai. Now, a little bit of physics. We only see a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. So here's a representation of the electromagnetic spectrum from gamma rays to X-rays to ultraviolet rays to visible light to infrared rays to radar to FM, TV, shortwave, AM, and there are even longer wavelengths going on. But we can only see a small fraction of this. Everybody with me?
Yep.
So if this total distance of the entire spectrum were 3,000 miles, the proverbial distance between Los Angeles and New York, what would you guess the distance that the visible spectrum occupies is? Namely, what fraction?
Well, it depends on, I mean, do you start at 0?
There's some issues about that, but just broadly speaking, we have a big spectrum and we can only see a little portion of it. If the big spectrum is 3,000 miles, what fraction would you guess is what we can see?
Well, I have a question. Is there any traffic on the 5, or is that gonna...
Yeah, right.
Or is it
Okay.
just
Anybody want to guess?
LA to San Francisco.
LA?
West LA, did you say? Or
Just Los Angeles city limits.
okay, any other guesses? A ruler.
Take logs.
The answer is roughly the diameter of a hydrogen atom.
Oh, wow.
We see a very small fraction of the spectrum. And the calculation of this is a little screwy, I will admit it. This is for Bryce, because I know he's going to go home and calculate it. It's a little screwy, but we only see a very small fraction of what's going on around us. Thank God. Imagine if you all could detect every radio wave that's going on around you. If you could hear every cell phone signal that's in the air around you, every broadcast AM and FM station, and so on. We only can detect through these eyes of ours a very small fraction of the electromagnetic radiation that surrounds us, and 90% of our interpretation or our conclusions is based on what we're expecting. I believe this affects what was written down at Sinai. Jewish feminist theologians also point out that it's the men that wrote down what happened, and had the women written down what happened, we might have a very different Torah. So I probably won't go too much further than this. So my bottom line is I take the Torah seriously, but not literally. The Torah is our central myth. And by myth, I mean myth in the highest sense of the word. It is the central story which holds the Jewish people together. I understand it as a sacred story and a teaching story. And one of the ways I think about this is in the story of the boy who cried wolf. Is anybody not familiar with that story? It turns out it's not in every culture. So when I ask that in a big room, not everybody knows it. But I think you all know the story of the boy that cried wolf. So did that story really happen? Is that story historical?
Doubt it.
No.
Does it matter?
Probably not.
No.
No.
Oh,
So
because it-
Plural.
I'm sorry. Yes, the purpose of the story of the boy who cried wolf is to teach some important lessons, and it turns out most lessons are better taught by stories than simple recitation of laws.
But
That's- Sorry.
it seems to me if that's true, You don't have to have a belief in God, therefore, to follow the precepts of
I
the
would
Torah.
never say you have to believe in God to follow the precepts of anything.
Right.
What I am sharing with you is how do I read Torah?
I understand. Okay.
And I read Torah allegorically, and I read Torah for the lessons that it teaches. The scholars would say there is no evidence in the historical record of anything in the Bible before King David, which is to say there are no records in Syrian history or Egyptian history and so on that correspond to significant elements of Bible. After David and Solomon, we start discovering archaeological artifacts. And after Solomon, there are records in other cultures confirming who is the king and what happened. So we don't have any record that proves that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob existed, that, you know, that proves, or I would say even suggests that there really was a Garden of Eden. But yet I study those texts, and I think those texts are astoundingly important for me for two reasons. First, the lessons that it teaches, and the idea, more than two reasons, and the idea that these are our sacred stories that hold us together as a people. And if God had something to do with the text, which I would say God has something to do with the text, I'm not sure what, then I want to search out the text to try and get a better understanding of what it is that God wants of me. And I always observe, you know, I have some of my old physics books, and I even have a slide rule. And physics books are basically out of date and obsolete by and large in a few years. You know, I have a good deal of the wall behind me is biblical texts and commentaries. And, you know, the Torah text is, scholars would say 2,400 years old, and it is anything but obsolete.
Yeah, but you're keeping both, so they both must matter.
I'm sorry?
But you're keeping the physics ones too, so they must matter.
Yeah, actually, the truth is I haven't kept a single physics textbook. I'm going to stop here.
Experience.
I'm sorry?
Sounds like you had a bad experience.
In physics?
Yeah.
I did have a bad experience. I went to an undergraduate physics school that was a liberal arts school, and it taught me a number of things that I actually knew at the time they were teaching me was useless, like how to speak before groups, how to write, things I haven't hardly used in my life when they really should have been giving me more exotic advanced calculus classes. But I got into a fantastic physics graduate school at the University of Illinois because I did a number of things as an undergraduate which were unusual. And not that I paid off the, they actually let me in because they thought I was going to be on the football team. So my training in exotic mathematics was really not up to my peers in graduate school. And I hated it. And the more I learned about physics, the more I realized it was applied exotic mathematics. I sometimes say we really did fill blackboards with equations. And, you know, 4 graduate students in physics, 1 problem, 6 hours filling, you know, 20 blackboards with differential and integral calculus equations, coming up with the answer, what happens to that stupid little electron. And so the deeper I got into the world of physics, the less I liked it. On the contrary, on the other hand, as I started getting into my Judaism, which was in my mid-30s, the deeper I got into it, the more I loved it, including, you know, arcane issues of Aramaic grammar and things like that. So I think I'm on the right course, but I did have a bad experience. Thank
Where'd
you.
you go to college?
I went undergrad Queens College, New York City.
Oh, yeah.
And I graduated with the top record in physics. And this was a school with, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 students. Of course, there were 7 physics majors. So I was the in the top of 7. Okay, we are almost there. So any other comments or alternative? Jim, you have your hand up. Yes.
Yeah, either I missed it or you got interrupted and didn't finish, probably the first. You said the multiverse is not compelling to you because it can't be tested.
Yeah, I don't consider it a serious hypothesis because I believe, and I could be wrong about this, I believe it contains the essential element that it can't be tested. So, and Murray, maybe you have more information about that.
I was getting the sense from your slide after slide about, everything fell into place. And I just have to keep going back to the room full of monkeys typing out Hamlet. In that, I mean, people, when you speak of infinity, people, the first thing that comes to mind is like, oh, a very large number. Well, I mean, it's not a number, and what I think, and what I've been thinking over the past few weeks now is, infinity is even larger than the infinite idea I could have even had, and that, I mean, we can have 2 universes, and one where this is happening, and then another one where I say the letter B, and here I say the letter A. And those would be 2 whole universes with a complete history of each one.
So let me take your point seriously. If we put 100,000 monkeys in a room with 100,000 typewriters, there's some length of time where probabilistically they would come up with Hamlet.
Mm-hmm.
I have a copy of Hamlet. Actually, I have a copy of Hamlet in Hebrew on my bookshelf. I have a copy of Hamlet. If you tell me that a legitimate theory is that it was typed by a lot of monkeys rather than by a person, I reject that as having vanishingly small probability. So what I would say here is, as I understand the science, I reject the idea that it's a cosmic accident, not as impossible, but having a vanishingly small probability. And I haven't, and the alternative response to this is multiverse. And as long as if my understanding is correct and you can't test multiverse, then I don't take it seriously as an alternative. But again,
it's not a scientific theory because, as you said, it can't be tested. I mean, it's an idea. It's interesting, but it's not science. But then again, neither is your belief in God science. I mean, they're both.
No, I'm not arguing it's science.
Philosophical ideas.
My bottom line, by the way, at the end of this whole discussion will be that living a religious life doesn't involve a compromise in scientific integrity and rationality. And that's why I'm presenting all kinds of evidence for God's existence. And there's a whole
that the multiverse shouldn't be dismissed because it's not a scientific theory.
I dismiss it as a counter argument to the material I just presented.
I don't.
Okay, we can take a vote. This is, when you teach your class, you can say, Baruch atah ha-multiverse. I mean, it's, the other thing I want to point out is just because you can say something doesn't mean it has realistic significance. And I'm not thinking the language through. An example is a classic example used by George Carlin in one of his skits. He said that when he was a kid, he would bug his priest by asking the question, if God is infinitely powerful and could do anything, can God make a rock so heavy that God can't move it? Okay. And that is not actually an exercise in theological investigation. It's an exercise in grammatical construction. Just because you make a sentence doesn't mean there's theological significance behind the sentence. One of the things, actually, I learned this from Piccioni, the guy who wrote these books. He was trying to explain to someone how is it that time began with the Big Bang? And you can't really ask the question, what happened before the Big Bang? And he used a very interesting example. If you're, and I think I may have mentioned this last week. If you're standing on the North Pole, on the very North Pole.
Yes, you did.
You can't go east.
Oh,
You can't go north.
You can only go
You
south.
can't. You can
south.
only, yes, you can only go south. Any direction you move in is south. That is not a profound lesson, you know, in physics or even, yeah, maybe it is in geometry, but it's an artifact of that actual, you know, that geometry. But it doesn't say anything profound about east has disappeared or something. So people talk to me all the time, and it makes me a little crazy saying, well, I can say, what if I traveled faster than the speed of light? I say, can't travel faster than the speed of light. Well, why not? I can say that sentence. Well, just because you say the sentence doesn't mean it has significance.
Well, let me just say this: that what the question, and it's actually a legitimate question, considering that the Christians actually do believe in the omni-God, and that is one that is, you know, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent.
Right.
So the point being is that concept itself is a flawed concept. And
I have problems with that concept, but not because God can't make a rock so big God can't move it.
Well, but that's the whole point. That's the problem with omni. You see, because that postulates something that is infinitely large.
So can I just say something here that, you know, we can all come up with a lot of things that like was it George Carlin? Okay.
Yeah.
Things that, you know, just complicate the discussion essentially, right? Like you're saying, and, you know, but, you know, coming back to the core of this whole thing, you know, we're trying to, Rabbi, your argument is a good one. You're saying what my evidence for why God exists is because of the just sheer impossibility, near impossibility, or incredible high probabilities. Anything 10 to the 100th plus power is obviously close to infinity as we can imagine anyway, right? So, you know, just the near impossibility of the whole situation proves that something else must have been going on here. Now, for me personally, I look at this one instance of the start of evolution. We went from an organic, static world to something where all of a sudden life existed, right? And, you know, the driving force behind that, why life wants to continue to grow. Why? What are there's a lot of questions wrapped around that. We could go that direction too and say we could come up with 1,000 things as to that are relevant or irrelevant to that. But there's mysteries here that we can try to understand and glimpse at because of just the dimensionality of some of the odds, and say that, wow, okay, so, you know, this proves that something must be going on here. I think, is that, you know, in concert with what you're saying, or?
I would say it's very much in concert. And remember, my overall point is I don't believe that living a religious life compromises my intellectual integrity or my scientific integrity.
Right. Yeah.
That's really the mega point, because many people will pose a false dichotomy saying either it's 6 days of creation or 13.8 billion years. Pick one. You can't have it both ways. Well, actually, Gerald Schroeder, who's an Orthodox Jewish astrophysicist, argues, and some of you will know what I'm talking about, that 6 days in God's inertial reference frame could be 13.8 billion years in the Earth's inertial reference frame. And that actually solves the problem, and he presents material to support it.
We had
let me just finish the thought. My bottom line is, if I understand the opening of Genesis more allegorically, and as our Jewish common story, I don't have to worry about science. I don't worry about scientific gotchas. Murray, you were starting to say something.
Yeah, that was one thing that we've discussed in Rabbi Barber's Torah study is I kept pointing out in the text that it keeps talking about in the evening and the morning or the third day, you know, like Lila and Boker.
Vihi Erev, Vihi Boker, Yom Echad.
And then some of them would say, oh, well, maybe a day wasn't a day.
Yes.
Maybe the earth spun different. And I mean, it's just like, no, it's right there. It says evening and morning. I mean, you can't stop trying to skate around it. If it was meant to be a million years, it would say after a million years.
Well,
so,
I mean, I would argue it's a legitimate question, because if there's no sun and no earth, what do we even mean by evening and morning?
Well, that's true. They weren't. The vegetables were created before the sun, I think.
Yeah, but on the first day, we simply have the separation of the waters above and the waters. No, I'm not sure when the waters. It's light is created.
Above and water below, yes, and they have to be separate.
I don't know if that's the first day or later, but
it's a nice poem.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a powerful poem, and one of the elements behind it, from a scholarly point of view, is the idea that in the Jewish creation myth, creation is orderly and purposeful and directed at creating humanity in God's image. In some of the other creation myths which precede ours, like Gilgamesh and so on, the creation myth is violent, gods fighting gods, and some kind of giant reptile god's belly gets sliced open and the earth pops out and there are people. So people are sort of an afterthought and a sideline to this epic battle of the gods. So for me, looking at it from a scholarly point of view, that's a very powerful, I get a very different image of God as an orderly creator who has made me a partner in creation. And that's what I derive out of that story. I don't know, Jim, if you have your hand up or just didn't put it back down. Okay, any other parting shots? Okay, so thank you. I will stop the recording.